sorrowing nor any dying, for God has said, I'm making all things new. These words faithful are and true. Things new. These words faithful are and true.
Delivered by a traveling representative of the congregation, Brother Martin Harfman. The theme of the talk is finding security in a dangerous world. Please give Brother Harfman your attention.
In a flood, you would seek higher ground. In a tornado, you would seek lower ground. In a desert, you'd probably be looking for water and shade. And in an ice field, you'd be looking for the sun and some source of heat. See, all of those things would serve as a means of security or protection or refuge in what would be clearly a dangerous situation. Now, what does that have to do with us? Well, who would argue that we're living in a dangerous world? Perhaps nothing exemplifies that as does the events of September 11th of last year. In an instant, people not just in this country but the globe over came to appreciate just how dangerous, how insecure this world is. And the world is fraught with physical dangers of every sort. But of course we appreciate, don't we, that any person could be a victim or succumb to those physical dangers that pervade this world that we live in. But there's another kind of danger aimed not just at a person, but aimed at a particular people that's far more insidious, that has far more serious consequences connected with it than any physical danger, as dangerous as it may be. To see what that is, take your Bibles, if you will, and turn to the book of Hebrews, the 10th chapter. Now there, the Apostle Paul is going to help us to appreciate just what that is that we're talking about. That's chapter 10 of the book of Hebrews. Two verses we're going to highlight in that 10th chapter, verse 38 and 39. Beginning in verse 38, that's Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38, you'll see the people that this danger is directed. It says this, it says, but my righteous one will live by reason of faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. Now, we are not the sort that shrink back to destruction, but the sort that have faith to the preserving alive of the soul. First, did you note in verse 38, my righteous one? So this danger is particularly aimed at God's people. And what is the danger? Well, the verse specifically says a loss of faith, a shrinking back from faith in God. Here's how some Bible translations put it. Defection, backsliding, fear, cowering. So what we're talking about here is a spiritual danger or calamity, far more serious and far more threatening than any physical danger. Why? Well, did you notice the verse, the word in verse 39, destruction? Interestingly, in the book of Matthew, the 10th chapter, verse 28, Jesus said not to be in fear of those who can kill the body, but in fear of those who can kill both body and soul. One Bible translation says, be afraid of him who can blot you out. So we're talking about a consequence that's eternal and everlasting in nature. And we know this danger is real. The possibility of shrinking back is real. The reason that we know that is that, for example, in this country, Jehovah's people would enjoy a fine increase from one year to the next among those that are publishing the good news of God's kingdom, except for several factors, one prominent one being disfellowshipping. The number of disfellowshippings in this country often offset or nearly offset by itself the increase among God's people. Doesn't that suggest that there are some who succumb to this spiritual danger? So what can we do? You see, we need a place of security, a place of refuge from wherein we can avoid or be hidden, as it were, from this kind of spiritual danger. First of all, let me ask you this. Have any of you had this experience? Have you ever been standing right beside a set of railroad tracks when the train went by? Ever done that in your life? Been right by the tracks of the train going by? That's pretty frightening, isn't it? You know, the ground actually rumbles and shakes when the train goes by. Who would think of stepping out onto the tracks with the train coming? So you know a sane person would do that. But now let me ask you this. Have any of you done this? Have you ever been in an airplane, maybe 20, 30,000 feet in the air? You look out the window and you see the same train. How does it look now? Does it look dangerous? Does it look frightening? Almost looks like a toy, like you could reach out and push it around. Interesting, isn't it, that when our position is elevated, those things that seem dangerous are suddenly put in an entirely different perspective. So this afternoon what we're going to do is we're going to elevate our view of matters that seem dangerous and take on the same perspective that God has from his elevated position. To do that, we invite you to take a look at Psalm 91. This afternoon, we're going to read all 16 verses of that 91st Psalm, and we're going to discuss them. We're going to be able to come to appreciate just what these dangers are and how Jehovah God provides refuge and protection for his people. For you see, in order for Christians to be protected from these dangers, we first of all need to know what those dangers are, what these phrases in Psalm 91 represent. Thereby identifying them, we're in a better position to be able to avoid them. And we can be assured then of the promised protection, refuge, that Jehovah God makes. So let's draw your attention to Psalm 91. And we're going to take a look to introduce ourselves to verses 1 through 3. Here's how verse 1 begins. Psalm 91. Anyone dwelling in the secret place of the Most High will procure himself lodging under the very shadow of the Almighty One. I will say to Jehovah, you are my refuge and my stronghold, my God in whom I will trust. For he himself will deliver you, note this, from the trap of the birdcatcher, from the pestilence causing adversity. Well, let's begin our discussion of these verses with the third verse. Did you notice the expression in verse 3, the trap of the birdcatcher? Therein lies this danger, spiritually speaking. There's someone, a birdcatcher, who has an interest in entrapping persons. A birdcatcher. It's interesting to note that in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 5, verse 26, it likens humans to birds. Now, who might have an interest in capturing humans as if they were birds to prey on? Well, of course, none other than God's adversary, the devil. He sees humans as prey upon which to feed. Now, why liken humans to birds? Well, interestingly, birds are the most active creatures on this earth. Ever watched a bird for any length of time? They don't stand still for very long, do they? And who are the most active persons when it comes to the proclamation of God's kingdom message, when it comes to the sanctification of his name? Of course, it's those people who bear his name. And so the devil would like to entrap God's people just like a birdcatcher wants to entrap birds. And like a good birdcatcher, the devil plants seeds that will lead a person along to be entrapped. And often his traps are obscure, camouflaged, difficult to see, hidden, so that they suddenly spring up where a person might least expect them to be. At the same time, the devil plants seeds that appeal to the fallen flesh, that appeal to the inclinations and desires of imperfect humans. So what are we going to do? Well, if the devil is going to think of us as birds, wouldn't it then be good maybe to think of ourselves that way too? How about thinking of ourselves as fledgling birds? See, who do fledgling birds stay close to? Don't they stay close to the mother bird? And so if the devil's going to think of us as birds, then why not think of ourselves as fledgling birds who have an interest then in remaining close to Jehovah God, so that he can serve for us as a refuge, someone that we can be assured of having trust in, because Jehovah God is not going to allow us unduly to have our spirituality affected in a negative way. In fact, now go to the 91st Psalm once again and look what Jehovah says in the 4th verse. Psalm 91 verse 4 says this. It says, with his pinions he will block approach to you, and under his wings you will take refuge. His trueness will be a large shield and bulwark. So, in essence, Jehovah here likens himself to a mother bird, as it were, who has an interest in protecting those young birds, those fledgling birds, by providing a security in connection with wings. But as we said earlier, in order to avoid these traps, we need to be sure that we know what those traps are. What is the principal trap that the bird catcher, the devil, uses? To answer that, let's take you to the book of John, the 5th chapter, 1 John, chapter 5. And here the apostle and Bible writer John will give us some insight into what that is. 1 John, chapter 5, and we're going to read the 19th verse. 1 John, chapter 5, and verse 19. The 19th verse says this. It says, we know we originate with God, but the whole world is lying in the power of the wicked one. So what is this bird catcher? What is Satan the devil using to entrap people? Well, he's using his visible wicked system of things. The Bible says, in fact, in this verse, that the whole world lies in the power of the wicked one. One Bible translation puts it this way. The 20th century New Testament says that the world is under the influence of the wicked one. That's an interesting expression, under the influence. That's an expression that you're probably familiar with. Have you ever seen someone under the influence of alcohol or under the influence of a drug? There's a crime that has received some measure of notoriety over the last several years. It's called date rape. Ever heard of that crime? How does it work? Well, usually the man puts some drug in either the food or drink of the woman, and then when she comes under the influence of that drug, what happens? Well, her inhibitions are lowered. Her ability to think clearly is affected. Her sense of common sense and reasoning is impaired, and now she can be more easily manipulated. The man can have his way with her, as it were. That's the interest of the devil in God's people, to put them under the influence of this wicked world, so that their inhibitions are eroded, their ability to think clearly and reason on matters becomes impaired, and then the devil can have his way with God's people. And what does he use? Well, he uses the flashy attractions of this system of things and the natural imperfect inclinations of humans. See, what human in this system wouldn't want to be rich? Wouldn't want to be famous, wouldn't want to be prominent, wouldn't want to be influential. And so that natural desire on the part of imperfect humans, the devil can use to entrap people. Do people want to be rich? Ever gone to some store where they sell lottery tickets? How long is the line at the counter for the lottery tickets? Sometimes you can't get up to do what you want to because the line is so long. And the people in the line, they're mad at the person at the front of the line. They want them to hurry up and get out of there so that they can have their chance at becoming rich. The devil knows how to appeal to the imperfect flesh. But Jehovah also knows how to protect those that have a spiritual inclination. Gives us two very important things with which we can contend with these attacks by the devil. First of all, to evidence those, let's take you to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. We'll see one of those provisions that Jehovah makes. That's 2 Corinthians. It's the second chapter of 2 Corinthians. We're going to take a look at the 11th verse. And here the Apostle Paul was concerned that there might be some in the first century that would be overreached by the influence of the devil. And so in verse 11 of 2 Corinthians 2, he says this, that we may not be overreached by Satan. And then he says this, for we are not ignorant of his designs. One Bible translation says, we're not ignorant of his maneuvers. So, for example, maybe here are two men. They're about to engage one another in an athletic contest. They're going to be combatants against each other. Often before the contest actually takes place, what do both of them do? Well, often they'll secure tapes that the other opponent is in. For what purpose? Well, they want to examine those tapes closely. What are they looking for? Well, they're looking for the weaknesses, the tendencies, the inclination, the habits of their opponent. Why? Well, one, so that they can protect themselves from them, and secondly, maybe they can take advantage of them. So, in essence, what you have here is tape on the devil. As you examine this closely, then you begin to become familiar with his maneuverings, his tendencies, his inclinations, his designs, as it were. And by being aware of them, we're now in a better position to defend ourselves against them. Here's a second provision that Jehovah God makes. It's in the book of Ephesians, the 6th chapter. Let's invite your attention there. And it's going to be the same verse 11. That's Ephesians chapter 6. In the 11th verse, here Jehovah God provides something for Christians to put on. Here's what he recommends. Ephesians chapter 6. In the 11th verse it says this. It says, put on the complete suit of armor from God. Now, why would you want to do that? That you may be able to stand firm against the machinations, or, if you will, the crafty acts, the tricky maneuverings of the devil. So Jehovah God provides for you a suit of armor for you to put on. Now, if you're thinking, when you hear the expression suit of armor, maybe like the Knights of the Round Table, you know, that's not the suit of armor that Paul had in mind. That suit of armor didn't even exist in Paul's day. In all likelihood, Paul probably had Roman armor in mind, and if that's the case, there's some significance in that for us. For example, those Roman generals, they were very shrewd men. As generals, their interest was to ensure the fact that their soldiers would remain in the fight and they would be moving forward. Now, how did they ensure that? Well, here's what Roman armor was made up of. You had a helmet, you had a breastplate, you had something that went around the loins, usually either very thick leather or metal or a combination of the two, and then leggings and footwear. Now, that's what was on the front. What was on the back? Nothing. Well, except the straps that held what was on the front up. So do you get the significance of that? As long as you were moving forward in the fight, facing the enemy, then the armor that you had on did you some good. But if you ever turned your back on the enemy, what happened? Well, maybe you know medically that some of your most vital organs are more easily accessed from the back than they are from the front. So if you ever turned your back on the enemy, you now exposed your most vital of organs and made them easily accessible. Roman generals were pretty shrewd, aren't they? Now, if that's what Paul had in mind, what does that mean for us? This armor that Jehovah God provides only does a person good if they're moving in what direction? See, if they're facing the enemy, staying in the fight, and moving forward. Well, let's take you back to Psalm 91, verse 3, once again. Remember in verse 3, it mentioned there the bird catcher, but it also mentioned pestilence causing adversities. So this bird catcher has the ability to produce a pestilence that can cause adversity. Well, what pestilence is it talking about here? Well, first of all, note this, that a pestilence is a deadly disease that has the ability to spread very quickly. And it's here used symbolically, figuratively. The psalmist links it with the bird catcher's traps. And over a millennium of time, what has the devil been successful in using that has entrapped the mind and the hearts of people? Used it to manipulate them, to maneuver them, to steer them. Why, it's nothing less than nationalism. It has indeed entrapped the mind and heart of people. And has it been something that has produced adversities? Yes. And is it a pestilence? Is it something that spreads quickly? Well, for example, let's take you back to 9/11. The days before 9/11, how many American flags did you see hanging on public buildings or on cars or in yards or whatever the case might be? How many did you see? Not very many. But immediately after 9/11, what did you see? They were everywhere, weren't they? Just like that, the spirit of nationalism sprang up and spread all across the country. Now, of course, as the months have gone by, many of those flags have disappeared, haven't they? Would evidence sometimes how thin a veneer nationalism really is. And has it produced adversities? Well, here might be something that will help you to answer that question. Do any of you here know how many nations there were on this earth in the year 1913? 1 year before the outbreak of World War I. You know how many independent nations there were? About 50. Do you know how many there are now? Well, Jehovah's Witnesses are preaching in 235. And that's not all of them. So from the year 1913, we went from 50 independent nations to now over 235 independent nations in the year 2002. And even within those nations, what are some groups of people desiring to do? Aren't they desiring to break off from the legitimate government and produce their own independent nation within that nation? Look what an adversarial thing nationalism has proven to be. And does it produce adversaries for people? Adversities for people? Yes. Even in this country. For example, do you look forward to April the 15th? You don't, do you? And when the date arrives and you have to fill out all that paperwork and send your money in, do you think that that's kind of like an adversity to you? And that's the least of what nations do. Ultimately, what they do is they produce wars and the death of countless, of hundreds, of thousands, even of millions of people over a millennium of time. You know, it's always fascinated me, even when I was a youngster, that people would hate each other because one was born on the other side of an imaginary line. Because that's what national boundaries are, aren't they? They're imaginary lines. For example, when you drive from here to Georgia, when you cross the boundary between Florida and Georgia, do you see this dotted white line on the landscape? There is no dotted white line that separates Florida and Georgia. See, that line on a map is in someone's mind. It's the imagination of humans. It doesn't exist in reality. And yet, because someone is born on the other side of that imaginary line, we can hate them. And ultimately, we can determine that it's appropriate to kill them. That's an adversity. Now, that's a pestilence indeed. Well, what are we going to do as God's people in light of that kind of mentality that exists among the vast majority of humankind? Well, remember back in Psalm 91, verse 1, it talked about the secret place, dwelling in the secret place of the Most High. What is that? Where is that? Well, I don't know. It's a secret place. Well, it's only secret because it's not visible to the human eye. Because this secret place of dwelling is not a literal, geographic place on earth. It's a relationship. The reason that we say that is because that expression is linked with the expression Most High. So it has to do with Jehovah's position. It has to do with his sovereignty and its exercise. And so those who recognize his sovereignty and allow that sovereignty to be exercised in their lives, then they come to be in that secret place of dwelling. How do they remain there once they get there? Well, remember, we were just talking about the matter of nationalism, and so one gets there and remains there by remaining strictly neutral to the political and military affairs of this system of things. Sometimes easier said than done, though, isn't it? For example, 9/11, afterwards, did anybody ask you what you thought about the terrorists? Anybody ask you what should be done to the terrorists? What action the nation should take? Or going back just a little bit farther, this last presidential election, as it became more heated, more controversial in nature, did anybody ask you who you were voting for? Anybody ask you where you stood on the issues, how you felt about how things were being handled? And sometimes it can be so tempting to express your opinion, can't it? And once we do that, where have we left? See, have we abandoned our sense of neutrality and then left this secret place of dwelling with the Most High? That place should not be left because it's so secure. In fact, go to the book of Ruth, the 2nd chapter. In Ruth chapter 2, here an expression is made that's very tender in nature, and it gives us an idea of just how secure a person is in this secret place. That's the book of Ruth, right after Judges, chapter 2 and verse 12. Ruth, the 2nd chapter. And in the 12th verse, it says at the beginning, it says, "May Jehovah reward the way you act, and may there come to be a perfect wage for you from Jehovah, the God of Israel." And now note this very tender expression, "under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." What a very tender and endearing expression that is in Ruth 2:12. Maybe just to give you an idea of how tender-hearted that expression is, how meaningful it is. Some years ago, Valerie and I were serving out in the state of Wyoming. And when we first arrived in our assignment there in about 1988, there was a forest fire raging in Yellowstone National Park. Eventually, the fire was put out not by human means, but by the weather. The winter finally came. It got cold. It started to rain, and then it snowed, and the rain, snow, and cool air put the fire out. Well, afterwards, they sent a number of forest rangers into the forest there in Yellowstone to examine the damage that had been done by the fire. One of the rangers, as he was walking along, saw what he thought was a very strange and unusual sight. This is what he saw. Up against the trunk of a very large tree, there was a very sizable bird with its wings all spread out and backed up against that tree, and it was completely charred to death. He thought, what a strange thing, you know, for a bird to do. So he walked over to the bird and kicked it over, and when he did that, all of its chicks ran out from underneath it. Now, ordinarily, if a bird would feel the heat of a forest fire, what would it do? Has the ability to fly, it would just fly away. But in this instance, that mother bird gathered all of its chicks up, nestled them up against that tree, then backed itself over them, spread its wings, and then let itself be seared to death. Even for a bird, that's a pretty horrible way to die. Do you see the tenderness in Ruth 2:12? Jehovah God likens himself to a mother bird that would do virtually anything to preserve the life and welfare of its fledgling birds. What a tender expression that is on the part of the sovereign of the universe. Well, let's take you back to Psalm 91, and we're going to examine verses 5 and 6. So let's do that together. Psalm 91. And we'll pick up the reading in the 5th verse. It says this, "You will not be afraid of anything dreadful by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day, nor of the pestilence that walks in the gloom, nor of the destruction that despoils at midday." Well, there's a variety of very interesting phrases that are found there. You see, by dwelling in God's figurative place of protection, we will not need to be in fear of any scheme that might be formed against us. Like the arrow that flies by day, the evil deeds that are committed by others will not cause us to cower. Whether there are verbal attacks, whether false accusations are made about us, whether lying propaganda is spread about God's people, malicious slander, violent threats, even legal actions taken against God's people, they will not prevail. In fact, remember in the book of Isaiah, in chapter 54, verse 17, it says, "Any weapon at all formed against you will have no success." Let me just give you an indicator of that. Some years ago in the Northwest, a group of brothers decided that there was a need for an assembly hall in their area. And so appropriate contacts were made, and eventually a piece of property was purchased, the appropriate permits gotten, and then one day the heavy equipment came onto the property to begin the work. Well, when that happened, then those in this rural neighborhood where the construction was going on began to get a sense of how big this project was. One of the neighbors took it upon himself to get up a petition and got enough signatures on it, and they actually got a court to award an injunction against the construction. So the brothers contacted the legal department in New York, and they advised that they get some legal representation locally, which they did. And they began to go through the court process. They lost several times in lower courts and finally ended up in a higher court. When they arrived at the courthouse on the date of the trial, they went to what's called the docket outside the courtroom. On the docket, they have all the court cases that are listed that will be heard in that courtroom that day. And so they looked down the list to find their case, and when they found it, this is what they found. This is what they saw. It had the name of the original petitioners, versus, so like, Mr. Jones, versus, and this is what it said, versus Jehovah. So when the brothers saw that on the docket, they said, well, I wonder who's going to win this. The case lasted 5 minutes. Now, you know, the judge, he reads all of the documentation, you know, before they actually get into the courtroom. And so when he got on the bench, he looked down at the petitioners, and he simply said this is the most frivolous and inappropriate injunction I've ever seen. He said, why the lower courts would have granted it and then upheld it, I have no idea. He said, there's no basis for it in law, case dismissed. Like Isaiah said, no weapon at all will have any success. Now, in those verses, it also mentioned the pestilence that produces a spiritually deadly state of mind and heart. Those pestilences had to do with some of the things that we've already talked about. Then it mentioned the matter of gloom. Well, that's not the gloom that God's people are in. That's the gloom that the world is in. And gloom about what? Well, gloom about God's purpose, about God's will, about God's intent toward the human family and toward this earth. They have no concept, no understanding, no appreciation for those promises and the way in which Jehovah God intends to fulfill and complete those promises. But God's people are fully aware of them and are in anticipation of their fulfillment. So while humankind is in reality in gloom, they think that they are at their midday that has the ability to destroy. Now, what's the midday? Well, of course, midday is the brightest part of the day, and that's where humans think they are. They think that they're at the zenith of their intellectualism, at the zenith of their philosophizing, at the zenith of their material production. Maybe nothing exemplifies that as well as does the technological age that we live in. Anybody here own a computer? If you went down to the store and bought one before you got it home and out of the box, what would it be? Things already obsolete. And you know, humans think that evidences how to the book of 1 Timothy, the 6th chapter. We're going to take a look at two verses in 1 Timothy chapter 6. That's verse 20 and 21. And interestingly, here the Apostle Paul talking to Timothy, who's already a mature Christian, likely an older man, maybe even having served as a traveling man, tells him to be on guard. And this is what he says in verse 20. 1 Timothy 6, verse 20. He says, O Timothy, guard what is laid up in trust with you, turning away from the empty speeches that violate what is holy, and from the contradictions of the falsely called knowledge. Now, here's the reason that he tells him to do that. For making a show of such knowledge, some have deviated from the faith. Paul didn't want that to happen to Timothy. Do you see what God thinks of the intellectualism, the philosophizing of humans? He calls it falsely called knowledge, empty speech. In fact, he says that it actually contradicts what is holy. Maybe just to give you a little taste of that. Recently, a man well noted in the field of psychiatry and psychology wrote a book, which is now available in libraries and in bookstores. And the book has been attested to by other experts in the field, including a former Surgeon General of this country. In one of the chapters in the book, this is what he said. He says, after further examination, perhaps it is not necessarily a bad thing after all for adults to have sex with children. Now, if that doesn't contradict what's holy, if that's not falsely called knowledge, then I can't imagine what definition you would give to those expressions. And that's the midday that humans believe that they're in. Well, let's go back to Psalm 91. And we're going to take a look at the next two verses, 7 and 8. For some, these two verses in this 91st Psalm carry with it the greatest sense of dread. And perhaps you'll see why that's the case. Psalm 91, beginning in verse 7, it says this. It says, 1,000 will fall at your very side, and 10,000 at your right hand. To you it will not come near. Only with your eyes will you look on and see the retribution itself of the wicked one. Well, that sounds pretty frightening, doesn't it? 1,000 will fall, 10,000 will fall. Well, perhaps in the future, those verses may have some literal application, but their principal application is not a literal one, it's a figurative one. Because remember, what we're talking about here is spiritual danger. And so the application of those expressions are spiritual in nature. It's not that we're looking for people to literally fall, but they will fall victim to the pestilence, to the midday. So those who allow themselves to come under the influence of human intellectualism and thereby allow their faith in Jehovah God and his purposes to be eroded. Imagine someone reading the book that we just read and saying, well, look, here's an attested psychologist who says this is all right, and then goes out and does it. You see, have they been influenced and have they fallen, as it were? Yes. But that's not going to happen to God's people. Why? Because our interest is to maintain our integrity, to remain loyal to Jehovah God in spite of the whims and wishes of this system of things, in spite of the trends and the things that become popular. Now go back to Psalm 91. And we're going to take a look at verses 9 and 10. In verse 9, it starts out with this expression. It says, because you said, Jehovah is my refuge, you have made the Most High himself your dwelling. No calamity will befall you, and not even a plague will draw near to your tent. Well, those are reassuring words, aren't they? No calamity will befall you, not even a plague will come near you. Now, the calamities that are mentioned there are those that we have previously been describing. But even if the calamity should be a natural one, like a hurricane or a tornado or a flood, the effect of those will be greatly reduced. Why so? Well, not necessarily because Jehovah God does something miraculous, but because Jehovah God moves hearts. Isn't it true that often when Jehovah's people are victimized by some natural disaster, that others of his people quickly rally around? So that the effect of that disaster is limited in nature. Here's an example. Some years back out in Wyoming, a brother got engaged, and he made this determination. He was going to build for his bride a home. And so he purchased a small piece of property, laid a foundation, and almost single-handedly, although he had little help from time to time, almost virtually by himself, he built this house from the ground up. And then after he built the house, knowing her taste somewhat, he painted it, furnished it, draped it, stocked it with the silverware, dishes, everything. It was completely ready to be moved into. And then without telling her a word about it, they got married and went on a honeymoon. And his intent was to bring her back to the house as a surprise. So he asked the brother to look after the house in his absence. And one day when the brother went out to look at the house, he discovered that it had burned down. So the brother called several of the local responsible brothers in the area, who then called a number of other brothers within about a 100-mile radius. A crew of brothers came. They knocked the rest of the house down, hauled off all the debris. They found the plans that the brother had used, and they rebuilt the house. And then they found the receipts of almost everything that the brother had purchased: drapes, carpets, furniture, dishes, silverware, and replaced it all. The brother said when he came back from his honeymoon, he said it took him 2 weeks to realize he was not living in the house he built. Now, why did the brothers do that? Because they didn't want that calamity to touch their brother. Just as Jehovah God does not want any spiritual calamity to touch his people. Now, did you notice, too, in the expression there, in that verse that we read, it mentioned there that not even a plague will draw near to your tent. What is that plague? Well, what has the devil used successfully over millenniums of time to plague his people? It's acts of immorality. It's still the number one reason that people are removed from Jehovah God's organization, acts of immorality. And why has immorality been so successful? And why is it so pervasive? Well, when you go back to the book of Genesis, why did angels leave their place in heaven and come to the earth? Genesis says clearly it's because they came to be attracted to the daughters of the sons of man. Those angels became obsessed with sex. And don't we live in a world that's obsessed with sex? You can't sell anything without sex. You open up any magazine that's advertising any product, and invariably there is a sexual overtone connected with that product. Why? Well, while those fallen angels can no longer materialize on this earth, they still have the ability to influence the thinking of humankind. And those angels, although they cannot take on human form, are just as obsessed with sex now as they were thousands of years ago. But that plague does not have to come anywhere near us. It mentioned there the tent. Won't come near your tent. So we want you to imagine something. We want you to imagine that you've decided that you're going to live on a very high plateau. The reason you want to live up there is because, you know, it's pretty and you like the vistas, the views. So you climb up there, but once you get up there, you realize that this plateau is given to some heavy winds. And so while you want to live there, you also want to be safe. So you decide that you're going to live right in the center of the plateau. That's the safest place to be. So you pitch your tent there. But you could discover that you're not alone up there on that plateau. Somebody else is up there. They don't want you there. So they come along and they push you off center. Now, knowing that that's the safest place to be, what will you do? Well, you push back. And then they push again, and you push back, and they push again, you push back. And this pushing back and forth goes on not just for days or weeks or months or years, but even into the decades. And then one day you decide, you know, this pushing and shoving is just getting old. And so when they push you, you say, look, I'm still a long way from the edge. I'll just hold my ground here. And every time you get pushed, and all you do is hold your ground, while it may take a while, eventually, where will you end up? Right on the edge. And now it doesn't take a push, just a little shove, and off you go. See, that's the devil's interest. His hope is that you'll get tired of this pushing and you'll stop pushing back. But when it comes to this plague, you keep pushing back. Now, go back to Psalm 91. We'll take a look at verses 11 and 12. Here's what it says in that 11th verse. It says, for he will give his own angels a command concerning you to guard you in all your ways. Upon their hands they will carry you, that you may not strike your foot against any stone. Those words sound familiar to you? Likely it's because these are the words that Jesus heard the devil quote when Satan was tempting him. Now, did those words come to be fulfilled in Jesus? Did they have an application for him? Did Jehovah God protect him? But they have a much broader application than just to Jesus. They have an application to all of God's people today. Just as he protected Jesus and ensured his safety, he will protect us and ensure ours. Even the stones of persecution and bans against the work are not going to deter God's people from carrying out their God-given assignment. Now go back to Psalm 91 again, and this time we'll take a look at verse 13. It says, upon the young lion and the cobra you will tread. You will trample down the main young lion and the big snake. Well, who do you think the young lion and the big snake are? Well, the Bible identifies the devil as the original serpent. And in 1 Peter 5:8, it says there that the devil is like a roaring lion seeking to devour someone. So how do we trample him down? Well, in that scripture in 1 Peter 5:8, it says, keep your senses. And in the Greek language, that expression literally can mean this, to be free of the influence of intoxicants. So one remains free thinking, clear thinking, sharp in connection with their adversary and his interest. Now, let's finish up this psalm. In verses 14 through 16, it says this in verse 14. Because on me he has set his affection, I shall also provide him with escape. I shall protect him because he has come to know my name. He will call upon me, and I shall answer him. I shall be with him in distress. I shall rescue him and glorify him. With length of days I shall satisfy him, and I shall cause him to see salvation. Did you see the reason why Jehovah God provides salvation for persons? Those verses indicate it's because they've come to know Jehovah. Not just to know his name, but to know him intimately, personally. So much so that they're motivated to call on him. In fact, in Romans it says, all who call on his name will be saved. So there's a need in order to receive this protection, to be in this place of refuge and security, to know the name, to call on that name, to be willing to be identified with that name. And the sooner the better, because we have an adversary, Peter says, like a roaring lion seeking to devour someone. With that in mind, here's a picture I want you to have. You're at the circus. And there you are walking through the midway of the circus, enjoying yourself. And suddenly somebody comes running through the midway saying, the lion's escaped. Now here's the question. In that frightening circumstance, with that lion loose, where would be the safest place for you to go? Well, where's the one place you know he isn't? Where he escaped from. You find that cage, you go inside and close the door, and you're safe. The Bible says the devil's like a roaring lion. Where's the one place you know the devil isn't? He's not in Jehovah's organization, is he? You get in the organization, you close the door, and you will have found security in a dangerous world.
God has commanded us to stay. He has given us a charge to obey. At all times be ready to impart the reason for the hope within your heart. So preach the word. Oh, how vital that all hear. Preach the word. As the systems and draws near, preach the word. Help the meek to understand, preach the word throughout the land. Seasons of trouble we will face. Opposition may bring shame and disgrace. Though preaching may out of season seem, our trust is in our God who is supreme. So preach the word. As the systems end draws near, preach the word. Help the meek to understand, preach the word throughout the land. Seasons of favor we will see, and the need for us to teach there will be. The way to salvation we proclaim, and help to sanctify Jehovah's name. So preach the word. Oh, how vital that all hear. Preach the word. As the system's end draws near, preach the word. Help the meek to understand. Preach the word throughout the land.